Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks for those two great talks that we've already had. And just to shape your expectations a little bit, so there isn't that gap that's been mentioned, this isn't a talk that's about this isn't an academic talk. It's not coming directly out of a kind of academic program of work. This is a talk based on the advocacy and interventionist work that I've been doing alongside my academic career for more than 20 years, that sometimes I've managed to get academic funding for at various times. So I'm going to be reflecting on the outcomes of that more than the outcomes of some of the more academic research work that I've been doing. So just to say a little bit about myself, so Sophie said that I used to work at the University of Brighton. I was the head of school there from the School of Art, Design and Media, and then the School of Media. And then more recently, I've started working at the University of Nottingham in a sort of proper professorial role, which is more research-oriented, which is very exciting. And right now, I'm running a wonderful project that ends next June that's called Leading Live Experiential and Digital Diversification, NG for Nottingham, that is like literally the last gasp of European regional development funding. So literally as we close, we turn out the lights of all of that funding. And that's a really brilliant project that is about taking kind of bleeding edge academic expertise in immersive technologies and putting those in the hands of SMEs, artists and performers in the Nottingham region. Really exciting. On the screen there are some example projects. We've got 31 new products and services that are being produced right now through that project, which is really very thrilling. Some of them with individual artists and others with kind of organisations. And so what I'm going to talk about kind of comes out of some work that I've been doing, as I said, for more than 20 years. Some of it here on the screen that started kind of 12 years ago with my work in an organisation called Feminist in Games, or a collective called Feminist in Games. And I guess my perspective is one of those where I've been academically studying the critique of what the challenges are in the creative industry sector, etc., and been rather tired of that kind of deconstructive work which says, oh, there's a big problem, and have been really looking for ways of intervening. So what can we do? How can we make a difference? And joined there by an international community of other scholars like me who are not just happy to kind of write about this stuff, but want to actually try and get in there, roll up our sleeves and try and make a difference. So I've been kind of learning what that looks like from that position of just real curiosity and real hopefulness for more than, as I said, sort of 15, 20 years. And along the way, managed to get little bits of funding. So on the screen here, it mentions the SSHRC grant. That's the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. They gave us some money for 5 years to work in partnership across 5 big areas of intervention in trying to really think about change within the games industry as a sector that had really deeply entrenched diversity issues. And so that was looking along the lines of education, so really thinking about why it is that, like Luke's saying, that you might have challenges in recruitment. So where in the education process do we need to intervene? And more and more insight tells us that in order to get diversity, you've got to be starting really, really young. It's not about university courses, it's not about secondary school, it's not even about the end of primary, it's all the way through the education pipeline. So there's a big piece of work there around education. And then there are a few others, one of which is very academic, and mine, which I ran, which was around industry and how might we work with the industry in order to help it recognise within itself where were the patterns and barriers that were really causing those diversity challenges, even when they really, really wanted and felt like they were committed to making change and even doing change. And along the way, as part of that funded program, I did a piece of work collaboratively that brought together 20 women from across the whole spectrum of work in VR to spend 2 days basically in camera, no social media, nobody opening the door, to just literally lay bare all of the challenges that they were experiencing. That was in 2018 that event took place. And that led to some really fascinating work and an incredible journey for all of the academics that were involved, where that work got transformed into a vision for women in virtual reality that we took on the road to big tech conferences and, presented a lot of really interesting stats to those communities that were very shocking about what was going on in the VR sector. That exists as a repository, as a resource that you can find online, the Vision for Women in Virtual Reality. You can sign up to it. It gives instead of kind of critiquing what the problem is, it gives very, very clear guidelines, positive statements about what you should do across commissioning, across culture, in order to improve the role of women working in that space. Really, and the 20 women that we spent those 2 days in camera with are now a really strong, highly bonded network who are supporting each other's work and then also supporting others like themselves, championing others. So we created a great deal, a kind of like a pebble, a ripple effect of amazing support through that endeavour. Another project that I've done that's sort of similarly motivated but slightly different, and I managed to get AHRC funding for, which was to put, again, kind of bleeding edge technologies, this time in the hands of circus artists to see what the heck they would do with it. My beautiful opening image came from that event. We presented those at the Spiegel tent as part of the Brighton Festival. We looked particularly for artists who maybe wouldn't normally even think about getting access to or even imagine that they might work with those technologies, just to, sort of disrupt the power differential between those who are at the front of the queue in playing with those toys. We made some absolutely beautiful work that is still now kind of being evolved by those artists. Trajectory Theatre, who made a little project called Circus in a Bottle that was making use of AR and VR technologies. They've kind of taken the impetus of that project to go on and from strength to strength in their own practices, but also then do development work for others, so kind of paying it forward, that sense of having been developed through the work. A more recent piece of work that I did, which is really distressing, is a piece of work that took place during the pandemic. That we were asked to partner with Share My Telejob, who are an organisation that advocates for job share within the TV sector, because they felt like the pandemic was really having an incredibly strong impact on working mums. And so we did a piece of research, sent out a survey that provided space for people to tell their stories, so it was both quantitative and qualitative, the piece of work, and it really reinforces just everything that the two previous speakers have said about the stress, the mental health issues. There are a lot of people who talked about being suicidal during the lockdown. A lot of people lost work, particularly freelancers and those who were freelancers and mothers who had school-aged children, for instance, were left at home, completely abandoned by organisations, homeschooling. And you can imagine just exactly how that doubled down on issues of diversity for those. So, as the quote says, being a mother in TV was always a nightmare, and now it feels impossible. And we continue to evolve that work, trying to seek policy change around support for freelancers. So I guess those were by way of demonstrating my credentials in the way that the other speakers have. So the work that I've been doing and what I'm going to talk about now is a particular case study of a piece of work that, again, managed to get a bit of university funding to work with the organisation Women in Games, who are an advocacy group that support women's participation in games at all levels. They've done some recent really interesting work around particularly the leadership gap. So what we were interested in doing was seeing doing a bit of research out with the community in order to understand what might support women's access to leadership. And that became an interest not just in leadership, but leadership for cultural change. So how do you support women to not just step up within their organisations, but also reach down, that really important thing about once you're in a position of power, how do you support others in getting up to where you are, but also how do you change the culture around you? It's not just enough to be in a position of authority, and then just work within the status quo, because what you want to do is change those cultures in the first place so that you can recruit a more diverse group. So these are just some statistics. You'll probably know this, but there is an amazing gap in the number of women leaders working in the creative sector. The games industry has a big issue around this, but it's also something that's very sector-wide. So across the creative and cultural sector, once you get into particular leadership roles, then there's always less and less women in those roles, and in particular in the sort of technology spaces. So there's a real challenge. I pulled up some statistics that are quite recent about the sort of where we are now post-pandemic, trying to understand what the demographics are in this sector. Are they improving? Because there are so many diversity initiatives out there. And there's evidence that there's a bit of a shift in terms of kind of racial diversity in certain kinds of organisation. It all needs a bit unpicking that about what that means in terms of class and in terms of geographic and also other elements of ethnicity. There is, however, still lots and lots of work to be done in the diversity space. This is another thing about I'll just skip over those because you don't need that. You've already had that today. I put these next few slides in to convince you about why diversity matters, but I feel like you're already on side with this. But this is, there are 4 cases for this. This is the one that is the killer application in certain contexts, trying to kind of make the business case for diversity. There was a piece of research done by McKinsey a few years ago that sort of landed the evidence, finally, that actually having a more diverse team does actually lead to greater profitability. Phew. Now we have a business case for it. So that was a really important piece of work that has had important eddies out in those quarters that are really resistant to diversity. There is also obviously a legal case enshrined in law. Is this need to have equality in the workplace? And there's an Equalities Act. There's also the ethical case. It's a moral principle to be more equal and to include equal representation. And then there's also the social and I guess the kind of representational case. So creative industries are culturally significant because they not only reflect the world in which the product is created, but they can shape people's sense of reality and view of the world. So this is an old piece of research about dads and daughters from 2006 that produced these statistics about the role of women within children's programming. And that, those of you who might have kids, who've been watching some of the Disney output recently or some of the animated output, there's been a lot of discussion around, the role of children's animated heroines and heroes in, just kind of shaping children's aspirations and sense of self. So I think it's really, really important that we don't discount just how important that is. And the other thing is to sort of diversity tends to get talked about in very particular ways so that we sort of understand what diversity means, we think. But actually, one of the things that we talk about in these kind of contexts that I set up is the iceberg of difference and the iceberg of diversity, where we have those characteristics that people can recognise and see that are really visible, and then we have this kind of absolute spectrum of an awful lot of hidden diversity. Neurodiversity, for instance, has really only grown in our understanding over the past maybe 5 years that people have started being aware of neurodiversity as a kind of intersectional axis of difference and inequality that's incredibly important. And there are some sectors that have actually attracted more neurodiverse people to them without really then understanding what that means, what that has led to within their workforce, that then leads to things like very, very poor mental health, etc., within those organisations. The games industry is one of those spaces that has an awful lot of neurodiverse people working within it. And then there are also, within organisations, other ways in which diverse kind of insider and outsider markers can be lived. And this is me starting to get on to, how do you intervene then if these are the things that are going on? So you've got this kind of complex set of diversities in place, and then you've got, within an organisation, you've got this sense of there are insider and outsider groups. And the insider groups always know that they're in the A list, that they are the A team. But those in the outsider groups can often feel very excluded from what's going on. And quite often your best performers might be in those outsider groups. And certainly some of the disruptive, creative potential of those sitting in the outsider groups is really, is really there and needs to be exploited. And they might be the people who are not, like it says here, not given the benefit of the doubt. So when they speak, their voices aren't listened to. There's also a kind of new set of challenges that are perhaps less well understood. So this is the Harvard Business Review report that came out, I think it's 2020, where they started to articulate this sense that there is this kind of second-generation gender bias that's going on, that even organisations that feel like they are trying to attend to diversity are maybe not quite getting it right. And that's about these kind of, there's this second-generation gender bias, which is a paucity of role models for women within organisations, gendered career paths and gendered work. And that might be things like the way that work patterns are organised in such a way as to suit people who maybe have a very flexible, adaptable partner. So being sent, the promotion opportunity is based on you being able to relocate for 3 months to another location, etc. Or being able to rotate between different offices in an organisation. Things like that just really don't suit those who might have caring responsibilities, and the ways in which women, an organisation might say, oh, I'm 50-50 gender in our organisation, and it turns out that all the women are working in HR and administration and all the men are in the leadership and design roles, and that can mask a whole range of real difficulties. And the other thing is women's lack of access to networks and sponsors, and we'll come on to sort of ways of intervening in that. And double binds. So double binds is a really kind of critical thing for women trying to step up into leadership roles. And that is the way in which performance of gender norms is like so internalized, and not just within the individual woman, but within culture, that when you step outside of those gender norms, it becomes very, very difficult. So a woman who is too masculine in her, or too normatively masculine in her performance of leadership, is condemned for being a ball breaker, or for being, or she's just being a man, or being too masculine or aggressive. And then if she brings her femininity or those qualities that are deemed to be feminine, she's empathetic, she's kind, she's emotionally intelligent, she's a bit too soft. So that kind of gender, that double bind of they're not really being an open conversation and acceptance of different forms of leadership, different models of leadership that enable women to see it in operation and therefore be able to live it in a way that feels comfortable and normal, and not like, what do I have to do here in order to get people to listen to me? If you're too soft, if you're too listening, it can seem like you're indecisive, whereas actually that can be a really, really good way of understanding what's going on, being context aware, making the right decision. So yeah, that double bind is something that many, many women in leadership experience. And, I'm a leader in academic context, and I've experienced all of that. I've experienced men networking really effectively around me, where they can even be quite harsh with each other, but then they can do a bit of kind of, yeah, it's all right, isn't it? What about the footy? And then suddenly everything's okay, and then you're like, well, what just happened to me, and why wasn't I listened to and included? So there are very different kinds of performances that are very excluding. So the little case study that I'll just close with is the kind of evolution of that work with Women in Games. So where we took all of that understanding of diversity, all of that research into the gap for women getting into leadership, particularly that kind of middle to senior leadership gap, and started to think about what we might do, what would be a pilot intervention into that space. And it was really clear from a lot of the work that came out that there was this need to intervene in 3 different lines. We've heard about them already. One of them is about, well, actually, we didn't talk about it an awful lot. One of them is this: in order to reach a more diverse group, to really recruit a diverse community, you have to not just open your door. You have to not just put a big sign up saying, everybody's welcome. You actually have to go to where the people are that you want to work for you and promote what you're doing there. And that's really, really challenging and takes loads of time and effort and thinking, and you've got to have to consult with people about how to write stuff so that they feel included. A kind of cultural organisation that's been doing some really interesting work in this space is the Watershed Arts Centre in Bristol, where they've really shaken up their very white, middle-class kind of demographic by doing some very, very deliberate work around their recruitment, which is very, very interesting, and you can find what they've done online very easily. The other one is about this retention piece that you've talked about. So there is this kind of how do you recruit and then how do you retain? And so what we were focusing on was, okay, there are those lines, but what we're going to focus on is this idea of developing talent into leadership, and leadership that is robust enough to make change. So really it's about creating change leaders, not just change makers, not just status quo, let's just lead in a normal way. So this was the kind of program of work that we started to do. We started to think about all these different things that we might do, thinking about mentoring and coaching, networking support, thinking about training at different stages in career, and developing these small group action-based learning sets, which I'll come on to in a moment, and then also thinking about Women in Games in the end, sort of maybe having like a formal certification that they might offer. And so what we did was we ran a 2-day pilot that looked like this, which was just the most, again, held in camera. No one could social media about, no one could tweet or Insta about anything that we were doing. They knew that it was 100% confidential, and it took place online, which meant that all of those who had difficulties in getting to other elements of the festival, it took place during the Women in Games Festival in September. We had a really interesting international delegation. Those who were in time zones that weren't UK time zones, they went into full-blown time shift a couple of days before so that they could be up during the whole thing. They were very well prepared to give everything over to this process of development over 2 days. And I have to say that it was completely transformative for all of those women who were there. It was just the most amazing experience for them. And they're now kind of working in these learning sets that they formed by the end of the second day. But they, one of the things that we asked them to do was to think about what kind of principles would you want in place to create an inclusive environment. They had these Padlets to put those on. They very instantly demonstrated that they knew what they needed in order to be developed. And they also knew what the behaviours were that they might need to model within those. So what that demonstrated was that, none of this is rocket science. What you just need to do is to listen and speak to those people and give them an environment within which they can be heard. And one of the things that we were kind of getting them to think about was this idea of creative leadership, having all of these kind of qualities that are down the right-hand side. And I think that both Chris and, I've forgotten your name, sorry, I'm having a gnomic. Luke, both Chris and Lucky have talked about it. I think that what they were talking about in leadership pretty much lines up with everything under that creative leadership side, where it's about validity, it's about concerned with being real, that sense of authenticity, which is more and more important for people you're working with. Authentic leadership seems to be the thing that people require from us as leaders. But also this thing about a jazz ensemble is the idea that you might have real difference in your group, that not everybody looks the same. And that's really important in order to be the kind of creative space that is capable of being innovative and capable of adapting to all of that change that we've talked about. The other thing that we got everyone to think about, they came up with what creative leadership was. Their model, all of our participants came up with almost exactly this list. They also came up with the characteristics of a great leader, which, I then played back to them what was on the creative leadership, the Centre for Creative Leadership site, a little bit adapted, that was exactly what they were describing, that what they wanted and what they wanted to be and what they wanted from their own leaders. And you'll see all over this is the word trust, which has obviously come up already, that idea of having values, and the idea of how do you build trust? You build trust through both kind of really clearly embodying some clearly having some values and then performing them in everything that you do. And this thing about delegation, which you've already mentioned, so I won't go through all of them. This learning agility, this ability to kind of respond to and learn from others is really interesting. And one thing that organisations that really, really want to go through a process of change might think about instigating some reverse mentoring programs in order to take people from within their organisation who may be in more junior roles and really learn from them what it is that is impeding their progress, and that being curious about what's going on in your organisation is really key. I'm nearly done. So I'm just about to finish. So the other thing that we instilled in them was this idea, and I think this has come up already, is about listening. And the person that we gave them as homework to read was the wonderful work of Nancy Klein, the author of Time to Think, but also she's got lots of wonderful new work, but many of you might know her work. The quality of your attention determines the quality of other people's thinking. So that fact of kind of creating these listening environments and helping our delegates to spend time in the first half of the first day kind of reflecting on how to listen to each other and how to, through that listening, really hear the differences and find a way of holding and upholding those differences in that space together, which is extraordinary. And on that point of the double bind, this is the wonderful Jacinda Ardern sort of talking about exactly that. One of the criticisms I've faced over the years, I'm not aggressive enough or assertive enough, or maybe somehow because I'm empathetic, it means I'm weak. I totally rebel against that. I refuse to believe that you cannot be both compassionate and strong. And I think during the pandemic, what Jacinda Ardern showed us was like this real global leadership that was actually coming from a very compassionate place, which is really interesting, and a fantastic antidote to our leaders right now who just make me appalled. So just very, very finally, these are the kind of guidelines that came out of that work with maybe the people that are sitting outside or within your organisations who don't feel very well supported, that these are the organisational structures or the cultural practices that will make them be included and that will make them able to be leaders at every level. And based on that idea that organisational cultures are made, not found, which I think is what you're also saying, Chris, that these are organisational cultures are lived through the daily practices that you embody as a community. So encourage creative leadership behaviours amongst all employees. Shouldn't be something that is just for a few. Everybody should be leading everything. You know, that leader mentality, that being a change agent, really important. I've highlighted the courage bit of the encourage because it takes a lot of bravery to notice when those visible organisational values and principles aren't actually being upheld. When you're in a meeting where you notice that somebody's ideas are being run roughshod over, or you notice that there's creeping in a kind of joking culture that's maybe actually a little bit problematic, how do you gird your loins in order to be able to say, actually, do you know what? That doesn't seem like it's in line with our values. Can we not do that? Have a clear protocol for what to do when behaviours don't conform to those values. So making it really clear to everyone that we can point to the sign that says, hey, we were going to respect each other. Let's make sure we're doing that. Find ways to listen to each other. What is your organisational culture's listening tool? What is it? Is it a weekly meeting that you have where all voices can be heard? Make sure there's something, and make sure you know how you are listening and how people can feel heard. Challenge the accepted practices that identify and reward success. Think about, I think it's Grace Hopper who said, like, the worst phrase in the human language is, we've always done it this way. So don't ever have like that, if somebody's saying, well, hang on, why are you doing? Listen to that person, because they might be telling you that the way that you're doing things aren't actually as inclusive, or maybe they're not as innovative or creative as they could be. Identify where existing networking practices might exclude and diversify those practices. So if it turns out that a lot of your networking happens between 5 and 7 in the evening or 4 and 6 in the evening, okay, I'm not taking that away from you, but think about other ways. Maybe there's a lunchtime networking thing that means that those people who at the end of the day have to go and don't want to be looked at because they're having to go, can go to their caring responsibility or to their other responsibility without being excluded from the networking. So if the only way you're doing networking is outside working hours, you're already completely excluding a whole bunch of people who've got very, very complex network of practices that are happening that enable them to be there from the hours of 9 till 4 or 8 till 4 or 10 till 6, whatever it is. Don't then start to expect them to do other stuff and that be where the core networking, affiliation, bonding happens, because then they're not going to be in it. Sponsor and champion colleagues with potential. Find a way of creating champions and sponsorship within your organisation. And that can be like, you can mix the genders up there and you mix everything up there. But just find a way of doing that. So, how do you identify a talent and then sponsor them? Find a way of saying, hey, what about that job there? And how can I move you on? Do that, because it's such an amazingly empowering thing to do on all sides. Nothing feels more lovely than seeing the talented person that you sponsored really flourish. You can bask in the reflected glow of your cleverness. Create a thinking environment modelled by leaders at all levels. Reflection, thinking. If people say you're doing something that maybe isn't so great, listen. Don't be defensive. Don't say, oh no, don't say that to me, I'm brilliant. Say, that's really interesting. Tell me more. I want to learn why it is that you think that. But also, importantly, give time to these practices. Make them core and not peripheral to your organisational culture. And don't ever let Project Crunch be an excuse to ignore the above. So I guess that in a rider to that emphasis on speed, I would say never let speed and velocity and all of those wonderful things that have been, throw your principles out, because there's an awful lot of games companies that I know of who have fantastic diversity programs, who do really amazing work, and then at that point where they have to suddenly grow to meet a new project, they just hire a whole bunch of people who look like them. And suddenly you've got an organisation that looked really diverse and that suddenly looks very different indeed. So that's it for me. Thank you.